The survival probability on the main telemetry shattered, flickering between 0.3% and a flat zero. Kilk's didn't just see the data, he felt it. His gravity sensor organs, usually as steady as a planetary core, began to oscillate with a violent, sickening rhythm. Every time the human Petra took a step toward the airlock, Kilvex's inner ear screamed that the station's mass was shifting, tilting, or perhaps liquefying. It was a phantom reading, a biological glitch triggered by the sheer, dense impossibility of a Deathworlder's presence. The siren had been wailing for 40 minutes. But when the surface of Wrath Cows finally bloomed on the primary screens, the siren's shriek was swallowed by the visual of the storm. The wind wasn't just moving. It was erasing the landscape in curtains of pH 2.8 acid and kinetic fury. Below, the Class 11 extinction event roared. A monster that had claimed every drone the Academy had ever dared to land. What happened next? I wish I could say it ended there. Stay close. 11 hours earlier, the station's air had been filtered, scentless, and heavy with the quiet arrogance of a Class 1 civilization. Kilks had been reviewing the cadet rosters when Petra first walked into the briefing room. She was compact, a collection of weathered skin and eyes the color of a storm-tossed Atlantic. While other cadets adjusted their multi-million credit environmental rigs, checking seals and recalibrating hollow NAV suites, Petra was focused on something smaller. Beneath the observation deck, something shifted. Petra pulled a crumpled square of cellulose from a jacket pocket. It was a hand-drawn map, the edges frayed and the surface covered in the faint, silvery scratch of a 2B pencil. Kilvex watched as she ran a thumb over a ridgeline she had drawn herself. To his senses, the map was a dead thing. Carbon-based pigment on a primitive fiber sheet. It had no data value, no uplink, and zero predictive capability. Is that a decorative artifact? Cadet Petra Kilks asked, his voice wavering as his senses read her mass as 4 times its actual value. He felt as if he were standing next to a localized singularity. It's a map, Petra replied. Her voice was flat, devoid of the tremor that was currently making the Threniki cadet's wing membranes fold into a tight, frantic distress seal. My dad taught me to draw what the satellites miss. Cloud shadows tell you where the ground fissures like to breathe. Kilks's senses twitched, which meant the readings were wrong. They had to be. No biological entity could predict a Class 11 event by looking at shadows. The Gorokai rescue leader, a quadruped built like a main battle tank, watched the exchange. His heavy armor had cracked during a Class 9 training exercise 3 months prior. He looked at Petra's standard-issue suit, then back at the screaming monitors showing the atmospheric collapse zones below. He didn't speak. He simply stepped back, his armored hooves clicking a rhythmic retreat against the deck plating. The drop window is closing. The station AI announced its voice, a haunting melodic contrast to the carnage on the screens. Class 11 conditions confirmed. 99.7% fatality rate for all catalog species within 4 hours. Petra stood up. She didn't check her oxygen. She didn't look at the survival probability screen. Instead, she took a small, frayed black hair elastic from her wrist and tied her hair into a tight, efficient knot. It was a mundane gesture, a fragment of routine from a girl who had spent her childhood hiking Icelandic volcanoes, while tourists screamed in the background. Class 11, Petra muttered, looking at the monitors where a ground fissure was currently swallowing a mountain range. Oh, Tuesday weather. Kilvex staggered as she walked past him. His senses didn't just read her mass anymore. They began to categorize her as a geological event. As the airlock cycled, Petra didn't look back. She stepped into the vacuum of the launch tube with a casual, measured stride, her gloved hand resting briefly on the crumpled map in her pocket. The drop was a chaotic descent through a sky that wanted to turn bone to liquid while the other 39 cadets plummeted in high-tech pods designed to cushion the soul. Petra's pod slammed into a jagged, barceled shelf at 300 kilometers per hour. She walked out of the wreckage before the smoke had even cleared. The wind hit her like a physical wall, a screaming wall of grit and acid. Visibility was 0. The Threniki monitoring team in orbit immediately entered a full dormancy response. their wings sealing shut as they watched her vitals. On the surface, Petra didn't panic. She didn't even reach for her navum. She stood still, letting the 300 kilometers per hour wind batter her suit. Her head tilted as if listening to a distant melody. Then she knelt. In 90 seconds, using nothing but her bare gloved hands and a pile of debris, she began to stack stones. She wasn't just piling them. She was selecting specific rocks with a high mineral density, layering them to create a micro windbreak against the gale. "She's building a can," Kilvex whispered in the monitoring station, his senses finally stabilizing as he focused on the video feed in an extinction storm. "She is landscaping." Suddenly, the sky above her curdled. An atmospheric collapse zone, a literal vacuum pocket, rushed toward her position. It was a silent killer that turned lungs inside out. Petra felt the pressure drop. She didn't scream. She didn't scramble for a mask. Too much iron in the air. Metallic like the Pro. She dropped flat, pressing her face into the basalt and holding her breath with a discipline that defied every biological instinct Kilvex had ever recorded. She waited 5 seconds. 10. The vacuum passed, a silent ghost of death, and Petra simply pushed herself back up, wiped acid dust from her visor, and checked her map. The monitoring station was a tomb of high-tech silence. On the primary telemetry, the Gorokai rescue leader watched a human heart rate, Petra's heart rate, and saw something that defied every survival manual in the sector. It wasn't spiking. It wasn't crashing. It was a steady, rhythmic thrum, the biological equivalent of a heavy-duty engine idling in the mud. She is still moving," the Frenicky cadet whispered, his voice muffled by the thick defensive seal of his wing membranes. Petra was 6 hours into a continuous walk through 300 kilometers per hour wind corridors. Her standard-issue environmental suit was shredded. The outer carbon lattice was reduced to gray ribbons that lashed against her limbs like whips. Her skin was a map of deep, angry thermal flushes and acid stings. Yet her pace remained unchanged. She didn't fight the wind. She leaned into it at a precise 45 degrees angle, using the kinetic energy of the Class 11 storm to push her forward. Deep beneath the surface, a ground fissure groaned. It was a sound felt in the marrow, a tectonic warning that usually preceded a total crust collapse. Dead. Petra felt the vibration through the thick rubber soles of her boots, the same boots she had used to navigate the shifting lava fields of the Reykjans Peninsula. She didn't look down. She shifted away 2 seconds before the basalt beneath her left foot disintegrated into a glowing orange mire. "Anomalous biological reading," the station AI whispered, its voice flickering with a rare note of processing uncertainty. "Classification: Deathworld origin. Recommendation: observe only." Kilk's had to sit down. His gravity sensor organs were no longer just recalibrating. They were surrendering, reading the mass of the girl on the screen as a permanent, immovable feature of the planetary landscape. He watched as Petra found a momentarily stable lee behind a jagged obsidian spire and, with the calm of a librarian, sat down. She pulled a crushed vacuum-sealed ration bar from her utility belt. The monitoring station went cold. A dozen alien observers watched in horrified fascination as Petra peeled back the foil, checked the wind direction one last time, and began to eat. "Is she picnicking?" a technician stammered, his crystalline limbs vibrating with a frequency of pure disbelief. "We had worse at summer camp," Petra muttered to herself, the audio pickup catching the dry, raspy grit of her voice. She wasn't being brave. She was being practical. Her body was a furnace that required fuel to maintain the self-repairing structural damage of strained ligaments and bruised ribs. A biological inheritance from a world where 8 million species had spent an eternity trying to eat each other. Suddenly, a toxin pocket, a concentrated cloud of atmospheric sulfur and heavy metals, rolled over her position. Too much iron in the air, metallic, like the smell of the old forge in her father's workshop. She pulled the collar of her suit up over her nose, breathing through the makeshift filter of the inner lining. She coughed once, a sharp, wet sound that made the Frenicky cadet flinch, and then she simply kept walking. She had discovered the storm had a rhythm, a percussion of pressure changes and thermal shifts that she began to use as a roadmap. By hour 11, the Academy's data reached its breaking point. The scientists pulled the Earth files. They read about the 8.7 million species competing in a violent biodiversity filter. They read about the domestication of apex predators. And they finally saw the number that silenced the room. 47 kilometers per hour. Earth's recorded maximum wind speed was nearly 100 units higher than the extinction event currently ravaging breath cows. She didn't survive our storm, Kilks realized. His voice hollow as his senses finally settled into a dull, respectful ache. She downgraded it. When the extraction shovel finally pierced the clouds during a momentary lull, they found her standing at the designated coordinates. She wasn't waving. She wasn't signaling for help. She was standing over a pile of stacked stones, adjusting her shredded sleeve. The extraction team recovered the crumpled hand-drawn map from her pocket 3 hours later. By the next morning, the Academy's central bureaucracy had authorized an emergency rewrite of the Interstellar Contact Handbook. The new directive was clear. Deathworld origin species do not deploy in training conditions below Class 13. Considering the current galactic maximum was Class 12, the message was unspoken but understood. Stay out of the humans' way. The map was placed behind reinforced glass in the Academy's survival wing. It was no longer classified as a decorative reproduction, but as a masterwork of predictive geological intuition that had matched the actual safe corridors of the storm with 94.2% accuracy. Kilks Dren stood before the display 3 days later, his senses still twitching whenever Petra walked through the nearby corridors. He looked at the pencil marks, the tiny human scratches of graphite that had navigated an extinction event. Petra walked by, her hair tied back with that same frayed black elastic. Her eyes were already scanning the horizon for the next challenge.